Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, well, good morning, everybody. It's game day for us. We're pretty excited to be able to host this. We know it's not ideal to do this virtually, but we'll try to make this as fun as possible. We're super excited about this type of work, conserving the land, helping people, helping wildlife. And so we want to kick things off here with a little bit of background on the why. I always feel like I don't care who you are, if you're a kid, if you're an adult, the number one thing you want to know when someone starts talking is why. And you're not going to move on to the how and what until you understand that. And so hopefully I'm going to give you a little bit of ammunition here as you're working with partners and landowners across the state trying to implement this work. You can use some of this information to help you articulate why would we want to do this. And so I'm going to just kill my camera just for the sake of bandwidth and get going here. So putting it simply, in the West, water is life. Water is life, not only to a wide diversity of wildlife and fish species that occupy this Intermountain West, but to the people that live there, our working lands. This is kind of the lifeblood of the West. And so there is really nothing more important than that water resource in our region, and it's precious. And if you can read the landscape, you see signs of degradation written across it. Indications that perhaps this land was once more productive and that something's not quite right. And so we're so used to seeing this across the land that it's somewhat become normal. I often like to joke that I think most of what we needed to know we learned by 5th grade, and then we spend the rest of our lives forgetting it. Remember the water cycle? That's really what we're talking about fixing here. We want a functional water cycle where that little bit of moisture that we get in our region gets put to work in the soil in the form of that soil moisture and groundwater that really feeds the productivity of the land and gives rise to healthy and productive human communities. And we're just trying to take advantage of that limited moisture for as long as we can before it goes back into the atmosphere or out to the ocean. And we share a common goal and a vision for what this is about. And it really boils down to resiliency. If we're able to repair these incised valley bottoms and help them store that moisture in the soil for longer, we take advantage of that natural piggy bank out there that we can draw upon in lean times that provides additional green groceries and productivity that ultimately leads to better resilience to drought, wildfire, and flooding. Of course, if you Google the term stream restoration or meadow restoration, this is what you often see. Tonka toys playing in water. And of course, this has become a primary means of restoration of these degraded ecosystems. But of course, we know that this work is actually quite costly. And, we are just simply not able to address the many, many miles of streams and riverscapes and meadows that are in need of treatment. We need more scalable solutions. A lot of those heavy intensive techniques are often done in the lower main stem drainages of the watershed. And this is a view of a typical watershed, right? And so the green and yellow are kind of those bigger streams. Look at the red here. That's our upper headwater streams and meadows, the small stuff that you can typically hop across or walk across easily. Those are the places where we have a tremendous amount of opportunity to perhaps benefit more miles of meadows and streams with a less intensive approach. And so what we're talking about here today is really one suite of techniques that we call low-tech restoration. And by low-tech, what we're really referring to is simple, cost-effective methods that can be efficiently scaled up And structures, if we need them at all, are basically handcrafted using locally sourced and natural materials, so we don't have to go to great lengths to fabricate something and put it into the system. We're also looking at how to take advantage of natural processes and letting the system do the work for us. And by that, I mean both the flow regime, sediment movement, but also in some cases, critters like beaver can help us do the work of repairing these degraded meadows and streams. And by doing all of this, we're allowing a much broader audience to participate in restoration. So you don't have to have multiple degrees in engineering to do this. We can enlist the help of many, many others who want to get off the sidelines and be part of helping out. And so we joke that the suite of techniques are really the sticks and stones approaches to riparian and meadow restoration. And in particular, as we looked across the West a few years ago, exploring different options, we kind of rediscovered some things that were happening in places. And we're really excited about the opportunity to help share this information and this quote technology with others across the West. And so specifically, we're talking about things like beaver dam analogs, post-assisted log structures that are being done more in our perennial systems. And then of course, the focus of our workshop today on these Z-dike techniques. Bill Z-dike pioneered this type of work in his book, Let the Water Do the Work. And we're talking about it in the context of more of those ephemeral and intermittent streams and wet meadows. And just to instill a little bit of confidence that this stuff does work, we enlisted the help of our University of Montana partners through NRCS and did some science several years ago, kind of evaluating efficacy of these low-tech approaches. And so we kind of looked at 3 projects that have been on the ground for varying amounts of time, from over 20 years to just 2 to 5 years in several different locations across the West. And we basically said, if this is, if it's producing meaningful results on the ground, we ought to be able to detect that from space. And we do that using satellite reflection of vegetation productivity, which kind of gets at this idea of resiliency, right? We can measure that from satellites. And what we found was that restoration using each of these different techniques basically increased the productivity of those valley bottoms by 25% and kept plants greener longer during the growing season, which of course is not only important to wildlife, but also to our ranching communities. And the big kicker here is that when we looked over time, what we found was that the longer restoration was on the ground, the more resiliency we gained. At the end of the day, productivity in some of these areas was no longer sensitive to precipitation. In other words, the sponge was full, the valley bottom sponge was full of moisture, and it didn't matter if you had a drought because you had water carrying over from previous years. And so that's the kind of resiliency we're talking about building in the West that's going to help us buffer what we know is going to be a more variable climate going forward. And really, we're going to go back to this figure several times today, but I want you to think about hydrology in a watershed context, because it is really all connected. It's connected to the uplands and also in the features that we see out there that are greener, those emerald islands in the sagebrush sea. And they come in lots of different forms, from meadows and bogs and springs to our traditional streams, rivers, and wetlands. And so we're going to talk about a bit of all of this context with a real heavy emphasis on those upper headwater meadows. And specifically, again, addressing some of these impairments that we can get on early before it gets too bad, where there's opportunities to keep things good, save meadows before they're lost, or bring them back through restoration of those incised gullies. And really what we'd like to do is empower you to be part of the solution. Again, we are working across the West. We've been trying to take lessons learned from other geographies and work with communities like yours to help them gain confidence in these techniques, better understand the why behind the what, and be self-sufficient where you feel like you have what you need to go try this out and scale it up, because we're going to need all the help we can get. Lastly, it's easy for us to get excited about this low tech work. In fact, some assume that by us constantly promoting it, it's the only thing out there. Reality is this is just one of the tools in our toolbox. And NRCS, when we looked across what we can do through voluntary conservation with landowners, we kind of categorized it this way. We said, there's some things that we can do that are higher cost that we're probably only going to be able to do on small footprints. They're important, but we're not going to be able to do them everywhere. And that includes things like conservation easements to keep kind of working lands working and water on the land, that traditional mechanical restoration that we were referring to. But then there's this whole other suite of techniques, lower cost methods that we might be able to do over much broader extents. And that includes not just the low-tech restoration, but things like grazing management and spring protection and enhancement, and even upland management of our encroaching conifers. So keep that in mind as we go along today, and know that this is part of a much larger context, but definitely this is something we want to fire you up about, because it is low risk, high reward, and we think you'll really be excited about the opportunities you'll see coming out of this. So thank you for that. And I'm going to turn it over now to Mandi and Mark to bring it back home to Wyoming.
Awesome. All right. Well, welcome everyone, and good morning. It's so great to see so many familiar names in the chat box. So we're looking forward to really getting into the weeds of it today to try to bring to you a little bit more insight about this work and what it means to us within Wyoming. So I'm going to start us off today by giving just a quick context about what this type of work looks like related to low-tech wet meadow restoration in Wyoming. And then I'm going to hand it over to Mark Hogan, and he's going to give a more in-depth view from a Wyoming partner perspective. So, I mean, even as land managers and specialists and even landowners that are very, very connected with our Wyoming landscape, generally, when we start working within these types of systems, our brains kind of automatically go to generally thinking about our landscape as pretty homogeneous and a sagebrush predominant landscape with a lot of antelope running around, right? But as we all know, being from this great state, it's very, very, very diverse. And we have all sorts of these small little green ribbons that are connecting our sagebrush uplands. And so even though, right, when you kind of like look at a ground level, you see a lot of sagebrush, when you get kind of up higher on a hilltop, you just kind of can see that connectivity from these green ribbons that are scattered throughout our landscape. And then when you look at it at a hydrology view, there's even more opportunities to work within Wyoming within these systems. So these are just a few maps provided by USGS and NRCS, kind of showing the hydrology within our state. Although, and I mean, it is important to know, right, that these vary from, perennial, intermittent to ephemeral streams and systems, but just know that there is tons and tons of opportunity to work within our state. And so then in kind of looking at all this, I guess, diverse systems that we can work in, it's just good to know that, not one glove will fit everything, right? We have everything from head cuts to some dewatered meadows, incised channels, to some floodplains that are not even connected. And so, like Jeremy mentioned, right, this is just like these techniques that you're going to hear about today. It's just one more tool in your toolbox that you can use because all these systems are very diverse and they have different kind of like natural resource concerns going on. So they're very, very flexible, right? You can use a numerous and a wide range of techniques to kind of address some of these systems. So I wanted to give you just a little overview. I know this work is fairly new to Wyoming. But I wanted to show you just a few partners within our state that are, trying these types of techniques and kind of getting that stuff on the ground. And there are numerous other stars within the state of Wyoming, but just know these are just several that I wanted to kind of highlight. So we have projects that have occurred near Lander, Wyoming through the Nature Conservancy, where they put on a workshop with partners to implement numerous Z-dike and BDA structures. There are other folks down near the Seed Skiddy, such as the Game and Fish, who put on another workshop to try to demonstrate this type of work within a little bit different type of a system. And then traveling kind of to the middle of nowhere over by Jeffrey City, Wyoming, by Green Mountain, there was a group kind of led by Amy Anderson with the Game and Fish that were installing some BDA work within a pretty dry upland system, but still there was a perennial stream. Down to Saratoga, where Noel Smith with Ducks Unlimited led another effort to implement Z-dike structures and to train some partners on what this type of work looks like. Then we have other systems kind of more up in the mountains. And so on the east side of the Bighorns, there was some partners that installed some BDAs in a more perennial system. Back down to kind of the southern region, south of Rock Springs, there was some partners such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Trout Unlimited that worked to kind of implement these type of simple structures within a system down there as well. And then last but not least, traveling back up to the Bighorn Basin near Ten Sleep, NRCS is working with landowners and partners to implement these types of structures there as well. So I think when you look at all this type of work over the landscape, I mean, like Jeremy said, we all get super excited, right? Because these types of practices are just one more tool in the toolbox. And I think we kind of overlook these types of systems because we're like, oh, they're green, they're doing great. But there's just so much amazing work that we can do within these systems. And so kind of when I really focus on why it's important, I think for me personally, and for the work that I've done within Wyoming, it goes back to kind of providing resiliency across the landscape. And so, looking at these pictures on your screen, I think some of the main attributes of this type of work can bring to us here is just providing a little bit more drought tolerance and expanding those green zones, right, which are important for both livestock, forage production, wildlife, and your hydrology within our pretty dry landscapes of Wyoming. This type of work can really help build resiliency within your working landscape, which helps support both your, the people that make their living off of the land, as well as the economies, these rural economies that are really driven by these types of landscapes. And then this type of work, like Jeremy mentioned, it's very simple. You don't have to have an engineering degree, which lots of us get kind of nervous when we're kind of moving into this type of work. But just know that you can do this and it's fairly simple. And like he said, it's very cost effective for us partners that are on a landscape needing to get this type of work implemented. And the same saves time, like I said, and has limited funding attached to it. And then it allows, like Jeremy was saying, I think what's so important is it allows numerous partners to really participate. And so you get kind of that camaraderie within kind of like your local communities with your federal and state partners, as well as your landowners and other NGO partners. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mark Hogan, who's going to give you kind of a little bit more in-depth view from a partner's perspective in Wyoming.
Thanks, Mandy. Let me see if I can get my screen going here. Welcome, everybody. I guess technically I can say welcome to Lander. Let me see if I can get this going here. Can you guys see my screen by chance?
Looks good, Mark.
Good. Let me see if I can take myself off here as well. So good morning, everybody. My job today is going to be talking a little bit more about kind of the Wyoming landscape, give my perspective a little bit on that. as well as some of the wetland types we have in the state and kind of where we're going to focus our attention with these kind of structures. And it's going to be a little bit of kind of PFW centric, just because that's my world. So just bear with me on that. Just to kind of start you off about, Wyoming in general. Most of you guys, probably are from Wyoming on this call today, but in the great state of Wyoming, we're really fortunate to be kind of between, have two major landforms where the Rocky Mountains meets the Great Plains. And so we have, starting from west to east, we have this western side of the state, or western 2/3 of the state is 13,000 foot peaks. It's high plateau. It's mountain ranges that slowly transitions over to the eastern third of the state, which, as you taper off into more undulating landscape, is more of what you consider the Great Plains. We have mixed grass prairie and short grass prairies. In the montane part of what we're dealing with in the west, it's more of a sage steppe kind of plant community. So we have this really variable topography, variable plant community, variable geology. The thing that I would say that has commonality between all these variable habitats and landscapes is that it's the waterways. The plumbing we have in the west is pretty much uniform across the state here. And so I'm gonna, so the plumbing, we're looking at a lot of these linear kind of drainages, and for today's conversations, this is not gonna be any kind of wetland delineation class by any stretch of the means. So the terminology I'll be using is a little probably descriptive and not so much technical. But if you look at the left side of your screen, you'll see some of these depressional type basin wetlands. And those are usually glacier, like up in the very left-hand corner. Those are some wetlands up in the New Fork Pothole region, Upper Green River region. Those are typically glaciated type basins that we have in the state, and real prevalent in the Wind River Range in particular. Like I said, those are more your classic kind of cattail sloughs that you see. As you move towards the center, towards the top of the screen here, you'll see more of a playa basin that we call them. They're windblown basins, and those are more scattered around the state. Those are the type of things we're not going to be concentrating on today. We're going to be concentrating on the things in the very lower corner of this slide here, and those are the linear systems. And those are our drainage patterns that Jeremy and Mandi were showing you in the state. And those drainage patterns or plumbing in the state actually provide immense amount of opportunities for habitat restoration. These sites are, characterized by being, kind of sloped. They're part of the water transport system and sediment transport system we have in the state. And that's what rivers, streams do. They tear down mountains and they bring it to the ocean. And so we're just a part of that. They're the most common wetland type we have in the state. And they're pretty much ubiquitous or throughout the state. And the natural plumbing system of Wyoming's watersheds, and they are really the center of today's conversations. So why, you're going to hear this over and over and over again, the whys. And here's from my perspective, hits home the most to me is these streams, these waterways, provide really landscape connection from the top to the bottom. They provide surface and groundwater storage, exchange, all those things you see up there. But from a wildlife perspective, and these areas cover only 2 to 3% of the state, which is a relatively small area. So we're talking maybe 1 million acres of this stuff across the state. But they provide the greatest amount of benefit to our fish and wildlife species. So when you're looking at 75 to 80% of all the wildlife species in the arid west rely on these kind of habitats for all or part of the life cycle. If you look at Wyoming, we deal with about 850 kind of species across the state. If you put those numbers against it, talking 700 species that Wyoming species that rely on these kind of habitats. So very, very important to the health and welfare of the fish and wildlife of Wyoming. So again, you're going to see some of the kind of a little bit of redundancy here, but I think that's good. So it sticks home. But, you know, from my program standpoint, the partners program, you know, when like Jeremy was showing about lowering the watershed, you know, we have more tools available to us lower in the watershed. We have more active restoration techniques that we have available to us versus when we get into the upper watersheds, the higher divide country. I would consider we do more passive restoration. That's been pretty much the history of our toolboxes. And what I mean by that is in the lower watersheds, as you see here, the 3- and 4th order type watersheds here, our focus has been primarily on fish and fish habitat restoration. And in doing that, it does take a lot of energy, a lot of resources to pull off, a lot of partners to pull these off. It requires an immense amount of time spending surveying, designing, and permitting to make sure these things stay in place. But along with these projects, we also are focused on wet meadows, oxbow restoration. So we're seeing that side of this restoration is the benefits of wet meadows, but it's at a more intense level. As we get higher in the watershed, we get into the divide country, the tools available to us, at least that we've been using in the partners program, it's primarily been more passive. And that has been more just working with our landowners to adjust grazing practices, moving away from season-long grazing possibly to more of a predicted time frame within these resources. And that's been our traditional way to restore these things. And we're always looking for new techniques because we're structural people. In my business, we like to build structures. So today's workshop is right up my alley. So like I said, in the upper watersheds, the stuff we really focused on was traditionally kind of livestock management. The tools we had were just fencing and water developments. Now to shift gears a little bit with you guys is now some of the things that we're working on. And this is actually fairly new to me, as new to the state. We haven't really, like I said, taken on a lot of this upper watershed stuff besides grazing. So this is pretty exciting I think for all of us. Just some examples where my crew is working with the partners, and I use we a lot, and it takes a community to work on these kind of projects. So I don't want to underestimate the power of the partnerships and all this stuff. And so these only happen as a result of the community of partners that we work with. But just some examples that we're kind of dabbling with right now as a program. The stuff on the left-hand side of the screen is some stuff that we worked with NRCS on, the Casper office, Kenny and Todd and the crew, put some really good designs together using some kind of traditional engineering weir with some rock structures to restore some wet meadow on Casper Creek. And we are kind of looking at now assessing that over the next year or two to see if we need to do some infilling with BDAs. But, you know, on this project, our role is strictly just trying to find finances to pull it off. And so that was our role. All the heavy lift was already being done by the NRCS. But, and so that's in the works. And if you go on to the right-hand side of your screen, this is some work that was done by the partnership down in Southwest Wyoming using BDAs. And so we're just, as a program, just starting to get into this world a little bit. And like I said, are pretty excited about the opportunities here. We've kind of focused, like I said, we're kind of structural people. And so there's some opportunities that exist. The replumbing or the plumbing in Wyoming has been, because of settlement and the need for water to put on the landscape, is been mildly saying it's been tweaked in a lot of places. And so what we've been able to do is go in and look at where that's happened and can we put Humpty Dumpty back. So if you look at the middle screen here, the middle of the screen, here's a project that was done down on Albert Creek in Southwest Wyoming by one of my staff. And it was really simply, there was a diversion or a livestock water facility placed on this drainage. It kicked the water out through the emergency spillway into the land, onto the kind of landscape, and it started cutting its own channel. So effectively, you got this straight line ditch that now replaced the historic channel. And they're very simple fixes, basically just cutting that dam open because it's filled in with sediment anyways. It's not doing what it was originally intended to be as livestock water, and basically just putting the river back in its channel. And then the old channel that was vacated, then we end up building some just wetland structures in. And so kind of a close-up, this is not the exact project, this is one we're working on in Lander right now, is just kind of looking at some of these replumbing situations. And very common across the West where livestock water or irrigation spreader dikes were put in. You can see by the arrows, there's some dams across some drainages. And once that water gets kicked out on the flats and the uplands, it starts to create some havoc and starts to head cut back. And then that starts these nick points start the whole system a lot of times from to head cutting. So very simple restoration. These is just basically removing these structures, putting the creek back into its channel again. Not rocket science, but yet there's a lot of opportunities there. And finally, I think here's an example. Here's the picture from over in the Kemmer area, the project I showed in the middle of the picture. This is kind of high flows. The system is then, kind of put back in its original channel. The water can attain its floodplain, and it's highly functioning. It's storing water in the floodplain. It's slowing water down through the system during its, when it's flooding. It's doing all the things we want these systems to be doing. And finally, here's kind of my last slide is, this is where we've struggled. I've struggled as a program as we see on the perennial side of this slide on the left-hand side, you see these drainages, these head cuts occurring. You get in more onto the ephemeral side, more onto the dry draw side of the equation or the continuum. You have these arroyo cuts. And if you look at those yellow arrows just above these arroyo cuts that are acting as a drain ditch to the upland, you have these nice mesic areas, and that's where these are headed. So in particular, that set of photos there on the right hand side of the screen is an area we're working in. And if you look up on look in the picture on the background, there is a set of hills, and this area has a complex sage grouse lek. There's about 10 different leks that are all kind of combined at this juncture. So we know this area is highly used by our local sage grouse population, and it's our job to try and protect those wet meadow, those more mesic sites. And the tools we're going to be talking about today, I think, will address these kind of locations ideally. And so we're looking forward to implementing some of these structures, and hopefully when Mandi does this in another year or two, we're going to actually have our picture on the state on some of these type of projects done around the state. That's really all I got for you guys today. And I would like to, Madam Speaker, I'd like to yield my remaining time to the great landscape readers of Sean and Jeremy.